Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We appreciate you being here and joining us. We're going to be getting started with our talk shortly, but I do have a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. First, to let you know, we are going to be taking a brief break from the California Labor Lab webinar series throughout the summer. So our next series will be beginning in September and we'll be focusing on a physical risk to workers. On Wednesday, September 25th, we'll be joined by Dr. Carissa Harris for a discussion on ergonomic risk and possible remediation through exoskeletons. So we'll be posting more information about that on our website as we get closer to the event, and we hope you enjoy a nice and restful summer. And on behalf of the California Labor Lab, a NIASH Center of Excellence for Total Worker Health, we're pleased to welcome you today. You will be muted during this presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, we request that you put it into the online Q&A box, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the California Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page within the next 5 business days. And all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form, and that'll qualify you for a certificate of completion with 1 continuing education contact hour. Once you've finished your evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Christina Biggs.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome everyone. I am so pleased that you have joined us today for a fabulous presentation by Dr. Zhou. Dr. Albert Zhou is an associate professor in the Department of Mental Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He received his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology with a concentration in occupational health psychology and a minor in public health from the University of South Florida in 2014. His research focuses on workplace mental health, studying how workplace experiences, for example, workplace mistreatment, illegitimate tasks, affect employee health, safety, and well-being. Also, the interface between employee experiences between work and non-work domains, and how to promote better employee health, safety, and well-being. And with that, let me share the screen with Dr. Zhou. You have the mic.
Thank you so much, Christina. And thank you all for having me today to talk about workplace mistreatment. This is a topic that I've been working on since graduate school in 2009. So it has been a topic on my radar for over for about 14 years. So sorry, just looking at the chat. Yes, if you have any questions during my presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll talk about that in the end of my presentation. So today's topic is about workplace mistreatment. We'll discuss some of the evidence of prevalence, antecedents, impacts, and interventions. So the information that I will share will be mostly based on the field of workplace mistreatment research, less on my own research. I will talk about a little bit about my own research when it's relevant, but if you have any questions about my own research about a workplace mistreatment, feel free to reach out. I'll share my email in the end of my presentation. So I want to give a quick overview of what my presentation will be about today. I'll first briefly introduce the concept of workplace mistreatment and some of the specific types of workplace mistreatment that has been studied in the field. Then I will present some of the statistics and evidence on the prevalence of workplace mistreatment. Then I'll discuss some of the known antecedents or predictors of workplace mistreatment, both from the perpetrator perspective and also the victim's perspective. Then we'll talk about some of the known impacts of experienced workplace mistreatment, mostly from the victim's perspective. Lastly, I will talk about some of the efforts in preventing and intervening with workplace mistreatment. And also, I'll briefly share some of the future directions that I would love to pursue as a researcher on workplace mistreatment. And if you have any questions on those, I'd be happy to discuss that as well. So before I will start with the brief introduction to workplace mistreatment, I want to talk about violence in general, especially violence in the workplace. So the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, which is a federal agency under CDC, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this. They have talked about 4 specific types of violence that might happen in the workplace. The first type is committed by strangers, and they are targeting people when they are work or when they are on duty. And usually this type of violence involves committing a crime. So this happens more often to specific industries or jobs, such as people working in gas stations or taxi drivers or Uber drivers. But usually there is no formal relationships between the person committing the crime or the violence to the victims of the violence. The second type of violence happens when between 2 people with a certain service-oriented relationship, such as clients, customers, or patients towards service employees or healthcare providers. So this type of violence happens more often when people have to provide service to other people at work or interact with customers or patients, such as people who work for sales, people who work in customer service, as well as nurses or healthcare providers in general. The third type of violence happens between people working together within an organization or workplace setting. So people can commit violence or engage in violent behaviors toward coworkers, supervisors, or subordinates. And this can happen to anybody who work with other people at work. So this is more often in the workplace, more often studied in the workplace mistreatment literature as well, which I will talk about with more detail later. The last type of violence that might happen in the workplace is violence committed by another person that a worker has personal relationship with. So this can happen to anybody whose spouse or domestic partners would come into their job and start to commit violence or crime. They're not total strangers. They're not the person that the worker provides service to. They're not the person that they work with, but they are the person they have that the worker with personal relationship. But when they commit the violence in the workplace, it's still relevant to the workplace. So although NIOSH introduced and categorized violence in the workplace into 4 categories, the literature about workplace violence or workplace mistreatment has primarily focused on type 2 and type 3 violence, which are violent behaviors or harmful behaviors committed by customers toward employees in the workplace, or violence or harmful behaviors committed by another worker to workers in the workplace. So that leads to the some statistic I want to share with you in terms of violence in the workplace. Is the workplace dangerous? Are we subject to violence or harmful behaviors in the workplace more often than we expected? I want to share some of the statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get a sense of the prevalence. First, the workplace is not fatally dangerous to most workers because only about less than 2% of homicides were committed in the workplace or in work settings, which is about 392 out of over 21 cases in 2020, which is the latest statistics. And these homicides, although they happen in the workplace, they were mostly committed by outsiders that the workers or the victim has no relationship with. On the other hand, workplace violence in general also accounts for some non-fatal or fatal incidents in the workplace. By definition, the NIOSH defines workplace violence as the act or threat of violence, which can range from verbal threats or verbal abuse to physical assaults to persons at work or on duty. So when we use this definition of workplace violence and think about the prevalence, the statistics shows that there are around 1.3 million reported non-fatal workplace violence in this instance between 2015 to 2019, the latest statistics reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But in addition to this non-fatal instance, workplace violence actually accounts for, which actually accounts for some workplace deaths. Workplace violence is the third cause of workplace deaths in general, but it's also the leading cause of workplace deaths for women, which connects to the homicides committed by strangers or domestic partners. They jump into the workplace and committed a crime in the process of being hurt, and people might die. So this is a leading cause for deaths in the workplace for women. But overall speaking, the workplace may not be fatally dangerous to most workers, despite the numbers shown above. But the statistics that I will show later will show that the workplace can still be dangerous because it's not free of mistreatment from other people in the workplace. So I want to briefly introduce the concept of workplace mistreatment, which is different from workplace violence in many ways that I just introduced. And I'll also talk about some of the specific types of workplace mistreatment that has been studied in the literature. So broadly defined as negative interpersonal behaviors from and or targeting organizational members at work. Workplace mistreatment can be studied from multiple perspectives. It can be studied from the perpetrator's perspective. It can be engaged by people from the workplace, such as co-workers, supervisors, or subordinates. But it can also be studied from the victim's perspective, that it can be targeting people at work, but they can be from people outside work, such as customers. We're not talking about strangers. We're not talking about domestic partners. We're talking about people with relationships with the employees. And also, one specific type of work mistreatment also can target at more than just the people at work, but we will talk about that in a little bit. With this umbrella term, we call it umbrella term because it covers a full range of behaviors. With this umbrella term, there are many specific types of workplace mistreatment that have been studied in the literature, which have very, very much distinctive features, but also a lot of overlaps conceptually and also from measurement perspective. Some examples that I will talk about and briefly introduce include workplace aggression / workplace violence, which has a very different, a little bit different definition from the NIOSH definition of workplace violence. Some other specific type of workplace mistreatment might include workplace incivility, which is lower on intensity, and also workplace ostracism and abusive situation and workplace bullying. And lastly, there is also customer mistreatment, which is specifically focused on mistreatment from customers. These are only a few specific example types of workplace mistreatment that have been studied, which I will briefly introduce each by one, and I will talk about their defining features. And then we're going to have a quick recap about their differences. This will be the foundation to understand the prevalence, because the evidence that I will discuss in a little bit will show that the prevalence and the outcomes will vary depending on which type of a workplace mistreatment that we're talking about. The first type of mistreatment that I personally have studied and also has been studied in the beginning of the literature is a workplace aggression. I want to give you the word-by-word definition of workplace aggression by Newman and Barron, 1998, which defines workplace aggression as efforts by individuals to harm others with whom they work or have worked, or the organization in which they have presently or were previously employed. This definition highlights that workplace aggression can take on different forms, such as it can be in the physical form, it can be in verbal form, it can be psychological forms, such as gestures or behaviors that are neither physical assaults or verbal assaults. And also this definition highlights that workplace aggression can targeting others in the workplace, but also can target on the organization itself. So people might engage in harmful behaviors with the purpose of harming the organization that they have worked or are working for. This definition of workplace aggression makes this concept of workplace aggression interchangeable with a lot of other terms, such as workplace mistreatment in general. So when we talk about workplace mistreatment as a very broad definition, workplace aggression can also be very broad, and it has been studied as a broader term very often. And also this definition of workplace aggression includes organization as a target, which put it is similar to workplace deviance, which covers interpersonal deviance behaviors and also organizational deviance behaviors. So workplace aggression, workplace mistreatment, and workplace deviance, they have been used interchangeably, but they all have been studied as very high-level constructs. So again, has been used interchangeably with workplace mistreatment, but it has been less studied right now because there are more specific types of workplace mistreatment that has been studied more often, and I will talk about them one by one. The first specific type of workplace mistreatment that has been recently studied since 1999 is workplace incivility. It's defined as low-intensity deviant behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target in violation of workplace norms of a mutual respect. The definition of a workplace incivility has a few defining features, such as it has a low intensity. It excludes any high-intensity harmful behavior, such as physical assaults, such as verbal assaults. It usually covers the covert and very low intensity harmful behavior, such as rudeness, such as being ignored, such as some tone in other people's conversations. It also has ambiguous intent to harm, which mostly captures the victim's perspective. So when somebody perceives that a coworker is talking in a condescending tone, then this person perceives that they have been the target of a mistreatment. But it's usually unclear whether the person who was speaking was meaning to harm or meaning to talk in condescending tone. So if somebody forgets to say hi to me in the workplace when we meet very briefly in the hallway, I might perceive that as rudeness. It can be considered as an incivility, but the person who forgets to say hi might not be meaning to be rude. So it's in the eyes of the beholder. So we might perceive to be the victims of incivility, but the perpetrator or the person who behaves, they do not always intend to harm us. So that's the ambiguous intent. And also, usually incivility violates the norm for mutual respect, because when people come to work, generally we expect to be part of a workplace that foster a norm for mutual respect. But incivility, it violates this a norm of a mutual respect. Is a non-violating behavior or experience. So incivility can also happen beyond the in-person interactions. It can also happen through information communication technologies. So this is where my research comes in. In a 2022 study, we actually studied email incivility to study whether people might perceive to be the victims of both active email incivility and passive email incivility. Active email incivility happens when people perceive that the other person was actively being rude, such as somebody speaking in using all caps in their emails, or their emails, the wording that they chose is indicating a condescending tone. Or it can be passive email incivility, such as somebody intentionally or unintentionally delay in response or ignore my request, then those kind of email behaviors can also be considered as rude, can be considered as incivility. It also can go beyond just emails. It can go to instant messages, can go to social media. So it can be broadly studied as cyber incivility as well. So in addition to incivility, there is also workplace ostracism. I want to give you the two different definitions from two different perspectives. I use the direct quotes from the studies because I don't want to, so that you can see how they are clearly defined. But when we get to the comparisons, you get a sense of what some of the similarities or differences among them. One definition of ostracism is from the perception perspective, from the victim's perspective. It defines workplace ostracism as the extent to which an individual perceives that he or she is ignored or excluded by others at work. The other definition covers from the perpetrator perspective is when an individual or group omits to take actions that engage another organization member when it's socially acceptable to do so. So it can happen it can be a perceived or experienced behavior, such as I perceive that somebody ignore me, somebody is excluding me from social events. Or it can be from the perpetrator perspective that I decide to exclude a co-worker from social events or from other work-related events when it's socially acceptable to do so. So this behavior is very similar to incivility. So that's why, and also it's very similar to some of the definition of a mistreatment. That's why ostracism has been studied as a specific type of incivility or mistreatment. And this diagram shows some of the generally agreed upon relationship among the three type of behaviors. So ostracism usually are specific type of behaviors or experiences under incivility, and incivility is usually specific behaviors or experiences under the umbrella term of mistreatment. Another specific type of mistreatment is workplace bullying, which has been studied for decades. It has a longer definition. It's defined as a situation in which one or several individuals persistently or over a period of time, perceive themselves as being on the receiving end of negative actions from supervisors or coworkers, and where the target of the bullying finds it difficult to defend him or herself against the action. It's a long definition, but I want to highlight some of the defining features. First, unlike mistreatment in general, or incivility or ostracism, workplace bullying highlights the persistent and frequent feature of its experience. So when we think about bullying, it usually captures a persistent and repeated experience. If somebody was rude to me once, it had never been repeated, then it's not bullying. But if somebody consistently behaving in a way that I perceive as rude, then that can be studied as bullying. And if somebody constantly talk to me or behave in a way that is perceived as negatively to me, then that's workplace bullying. And also bullying often happens when the bully and the bullied has imbalance of power, such as supervisors or more senior workers are more likely to bully subordinates or people who are junior in the workplace. Abuse situation is another specific type of workplace mistreatment that happens from supervisors toward subordinates. So it's defined as subordinates' perception of the extent to which supervisors engage in the sustained display of hostile verbal and nonverbal behaviors, excluding physical contact. So this definition specifically exclude physical contact. So it's verbal or nonverbal, but it's also very specific that it comes from supervisors targeting at subordinates. And it also can be a shared experience. And research has demonstrated that when within a work group, it's often perceived by multiple members in a work group that a supervisor behaves in an abusive way. So it's often not just one person's unique experience from their supervisor. It often can be studied as a shared experience. And lastly, I want to talk about customer mistreatment, which is the only type of a mistreatment that I will introduce that comes from outsiders. It's a low quality interpersonal treatment employees receive from from their customers. Its defining feature includes that it's initiated by customers against service employees. So it's not another organizational member. And also its behavior can be very broad. It can include derogatory behavior. It can include verbal aggression. It can include something such as unreasonable demands. Those behaviors are low quality treatments, but they can have negative impact on service employees. So I introduced the concepts of different types of mistreatment, including the umbrella term mistreatment. But there are some similarities or differences among them I want to highlight, which has been acknowledged in the literature or in the field of workplace mistreatment, but we're still working on to address that. First, most workplace mistreatment construct, as we talk about, exclude physical assaults, such as abuse of vision, which explicitly exclude physical assaults. But some of them do not explicitly exclude physical assaults, but they can still vary in intensity. Such as workplace violence, physical violence is specifically talking about physical assaults. Workplace incivility do not include physical assaults. Workplace aggression can include physical assaults. And workplace bullying can also include physical assaults, but usually they don't happen very often. Most workplace mistreatment constructs that we study include intent to harm. So if somebody is behaving in an aggressive way, somebody is bullying another person, a supervisor is being abusive, they engage in those behaviors with an intention to harm. So there's no ambiguity there. But for workplace incivility or workplace ostracism, sometimes the person who are the victims, they're not always clear, was that person talking to me in that way on purpose? Did that person exclude me from social events on purpose? Was I excluded from the meeting on purpose? There's a little bit ambiguity sometimes in terms of whether an experience is meant to be harmful or not. Most workplace mistreatment constructs can come from multiple sources, such as can be from co-workers, supervisors, and outsiders. But some of them might be specific to a specific source, such as abuse situation is only focused on supervisor behaviors. Customer mistreatment specifically focused on customer behaviors. But incivility can be from supervisors. Incivility can be from co-workers. And incivility can be from customers as well. And the most mistreatment constructs that we study capture different behaviors, but often they also capture the same behaviors. So for example, somebody talking down to me, somebody ridicules me, somebody yells at me, somebody excludes me from events, somebody is rude to me. This kind of behaviors has been studied in the measurements of abusive situation, in the measures of bullying, in the measures of incivility and ostracism. So when we talk about mistreatment, it's interpersonal harmful behaviors, but they have been capturing the same behavior very often in different constructs. So with these different names and constructs, now we can talk about their prevalence. So the reason I want to introduce them is to let you know that we have studied them in different silos, but it's time to talk about how we can group them, how we can integrate the literature to better understand the phenomena of workplace mistreatment so that efforts can be developed to address this. So the first step is to understand the prevalence, and the most recent meta-analysis in 2021 provide a foundation of understanding the similarities and differences of the prevalence of different workplace mistreatment constructs. So this table summarizes the prevalence of experienced mistreatment from the victim's perspective. As we can see, the estimation shows that overall, 34% of workers have experienced workplace mistreatment in the workplace. But if we look across different types of mistreatment, we'll see that some of them are more prevalent, which is reflected by the definition of them. For example, workplace incivility is low intensity behaviors that people experience. It can have ambiguous intent to harm. So somebody is rude to me, they may not engage the behavior on purpose. As long as I perceive somebody was rude, I can report this as an experienced incivility. So incivility as a low intensity behavior has shown the highest prevalence. So about 75% of workers has experienced workplace incivility. Similarly, ostracism, being excluded from events at work or being ignored at work, has the second highest prevalence. On the other hand, if we look at some of the more intense mistreatment experience, such as bullying, which has only 16% of prevalence, so only about 16% of workers, I should not use the term only, because we want these numbers to be as low as possible. But still, when we talk about the persistent experiences of bullying, still 16% of workers have experienced bullying. This meta-analysis also estimated the prevalence of witnessed workplace mistreatment. So to what extent people have witnessed or observed other people being the victims of a mistreatment in the workplace. Overall, about 44% of workers have witnessed workplace mistreatment. And the prevalence also vary. As we can see from the rectangle on the bottom of this table, it varies from general harassment, 33%, to 79% of psychological aggression. But also want to direct your attention to the fact that this studies has a smaller number of sample size. They're based on a smaller number of studies, such as psychological aggression. This number is based on 4 studies over with data from over 2,000 people. So this estimate might be biased. So compared to studies about people's experiences, studies about workers' observations has been less, but it's also important, if not more important, to study what would happen when we observe workplace mistreatment. What are the actions that people can take to help with the victims or prevent further escalation of mistreatment in the workplace? I also want to share some of the evidence about other aspects of the prevalence. First, there has been, the meta-analysis also shows that the prevalence of workplace mistreatment has been mostly consistent across years based on the year of the publication. But one thing that has noticeable decrease is sexual harassment. This is mostly due to the legislation efforts. So there are more legislation efforts to prevent or penalize sexual harassment in the workplace. But compared to sexual harassment, other mistreatment, such as aggression, such as violence, such as incivility, such as bullying, there are no legislations against them. And this might be one of the contributing factors to the consistent high prevalence. Also, the reported prevalence of mistreatment can also vary across different countries. So the authors extracted the workers' rights indices across different countries and to look at, do countries with more workers' rights policies reported lower workplace mistreatment prevalence? And they found that workers in countries with greater workers' rights they reported lower prevalence of mistreatment. This highlights, together, these two findings highlights the importance of having legislations or policies in place to prohibit workplace mistreatment or to protect your workers. I also want to highlight some findings from another meta-analysis in 2018 about the prevalence by sex and race. So overall, the evidence shows that women reported experiencing more mistreatment in general, and also they reported experiencing more sex-based workplace mistreatment when they are mistreated due to their gender or their sex. Similarly, racially minority workers, they reported experiencing more mistreatment in general, and also they experienced more race-based workplace mistreatment. I also want to highlight one study that we did in 2014, which we are trying to refresh the statistic in a new study. But in 2014, we analyzed all the data we found from healthcare providers, from nurses in particular, to look at their prevalence of mistreatment or workplace violence. We found that the numbers are much higher than the numbers that I showed you earlier. So over 36% of nurses has been exposed to physical violence in the workplace, and about 67% of nurses has experienced a non-physical violence in the workplace, and about 37% has experienced bullying. So this shows that the experience of mistreatment can also vary by industries, with people in healthcare, people interacting with others more often are more likely to experience workplace mistreatment. So I want to highlight, to summarize a brief model that will capture the rest of my presentation, which is talk about the experience, the occurrence of workplace mistreatment. So workplace mistreatment start usually with a perpetrator who engage in harmful behaviors. And there are many reasons why people might engage in workplace mistreatment. It may be driven by individual differences or individual characteristics, which I will talk about in a little bit. It also might be driven by situational factors that happen around a perpetrator. When there are perpetrators, there are victims of workplace mistreatment or targets, so they are experiencing mistreatment. But there are also reasons why they might experience mistreatment. So what might put a target on a person? It might be who they are, so there might be specific individual differences. There also might be situational factors. I want to emphasize that we're not trying to blame the victim. We should never blame the victims, but understanding why some people or some workers are more likely to become the victims, policies or interventions can be developed to better protect those workers. So the goal is to help organizations, help workers to protect vulnerable workers instead of blame them. And often we study what might be the consequences of becoming the victims or the targets of a workplace mistreatment. So their health or well-being can be affected, their behaviors in the workplace or outside the workplace can be affected. And one specific behavior that the targets might engage in is to fight back or displace against other people. Now they become the perpetrator against other people or against the perpetrator to themselves. So this model highlights some of the important relationships that we study in the workplace mistreatment field. So from the perpetrator perspective, there are many situational risk factors for perpetration. So what might be some triggers to what might be some of the experiences that might trigger employees to become perpetrators of mistreatment, such as some of the known or established risk factors include job insecurity, perceived injustice, having a leader who is not always there, who is not always providing the leadership that the workers needed, when there are situational constraints that prohibit a worker to perform their tasks, when there are interpersonal conflict happening in the workplace. All workers experience conflict from their family domain to the work. so that they are unable to meet both family demands and work demands. These stressful experiences, these specific stressor experiences, has been found to trigger workers to engage in more mistreatment toward other people. And I will talk a little bit more about the mechanism, why these situational factors might trigger perpetrators' engagement of mistreatment. But also there are protective factors. So when workers experience a stronger climate for civility, stronger climate for cohesion, stronger climate for support, they're less likely to become the perpetrators. When workers perceive that they have the support of their organization so that they can better manage work demands, they're less likely to become the perpetrators. And also when their leaders behave in an ethical way or moral standards, so that they set up a role model so that workers they can behave in a moral way as well, they're less likely to become the perpetrators. There are also individual characteristics that has been associated with perpetration. So what kind of characteristics might be linked to the likelihood of engaging mistreatment in the workplace? The research has shown that men are more likely to become the perpetrators of mistreatment. Person with higher trait angers, such as those are more likely to consider the situation as hostile or consider other people's behavior as hostile, they're more likely to become the perpetrators. People who have a higher negative affectivity, meaning that they are more likely to experience consistent negative emotions, they're more likely to become perpetrators. People with more positive affectivity, meaning that they're more likely to have positive feelings or positive emotions, they're less likely to become perpetrators. People with higher self-control, they're less likely to become the perpetrators. People with more agreeableness, higher conscientiousness, and less neuroticism, the three characteristics of personality, they are less likely to become perpetrators of mistreatment. So these are some of the example characteristics that has been found to be associated with perpetration of mistreatment. So earlier I talked about some of the risk factors of mistreatment, but what might be the mechanisms? So when a person perceives that there are situational factors, when they perceive there are job insecurity, when they perceive that there is injustice, when they perceive there are constraints at work, how does those situations trigger a person to engage in mistreatment? There are different mechanisms, and here are some examples. The first mechanism that has been studied a lot is emotional mechanism, meaning that people might, when they are exposed to those situations, stressful situations, they are more likely to experience decreased positive emotions, and they're more likely to experience increased negative emotions. And these emotions might drive people to engage in a harmful way toward other people. There are also discrete emotions that have been studied, such as anger, such as frustration, anxiety. When people are in stressful situations, they're more likely to have those kind of discrete emotions, which can trigger a person to engage, to behave in a rude way, to behave in an inconsiderate way, to behave in a harmful way toward other people. There's also cognitive processes, meaning that people really put thoughts into their experiences, and this thought has triggered them to engage in a harmful way. So when people perceive that they are unjustly treated, so they need to get back, they need to revenge, then this kind of cognition might motivate a person to engage in a calculated harmful way. There's also trust-related process. When a person lost trust in their co-workers, in their supervisors, they may engage in harmful behaviors toward those people. There's also resource-based perspectives, such as when people are exposed to stressful environment, they are more likely to lose self-control resources, and then they're less likely to inhibit their behaviors, then they're more likely to behave inconsiderate or harmful way toward other people. There are also factors associated with who are more likely to become victims of mistreatment. So some of the situational risk factors include some of the similar situations such as high job insecurity perceptions, such as a leader who is not taking actions when needed, such as when workers perceive that they have a lot of ambiguity in their job, they have a lot of conflicting demand in their roles, when they are expected to do more than they have a capacity to do, and also when they have a lot more, like just they have to work longer hours or they have to deal with longer volume work. These situational stressful experiences might expose person to an environment that they might behave in a way that trigger other people to behave in a harmful way toward that. So situational factors can trigger people to behave in a harmful way toward other people, but also can also trigger some people to become the victims of other people's harmful behaviors. There's also, of course, protective factors of a victimization. So what factors might help people or prevent people to become victims of mistreatment? A stronger climate, again, since it can protect people from engaging in mistreatment, it can also protect people from becoming victims of mistreatment. Having supervisors who is intentionally engaging aggression preventive behaviors, then employees are less likely to become the victims of their co-workers or their customers' mistreatment behaviors. And also when people have more autonomy than at a job, then they have a more control over how they do things. This might also protect them from becoming victims of mistreatment. There are also individual characteristics that are associated with victimization. Again, I want to emphasize that we're not, and we should never blame victims, but understanding who are more vulnerable to become victims, then we can understand how we can better support those vulnerable populations. So as we talked about earlier, women and racial minority workers, they perceive to experience more mistreatment in the workplace. Then there is a disparity against them. So organizations, employers, and the supervisors need to be mindful and be more supportive of their workers when they report experience of mistreatment or their fear of mistreatment experiences. And also similar characteristics, personality has been found to link to victimization, such as negative affectivity is linked to more experience of mistreatment. Agreeableness, extroversion, consciousness are linked with less victimization, and neuroticism is linked with more victimization. So people with certain characteristics are more likely to become the victims of mistreatment as well. One thing I want to highlight is political skill. In a 2015 study, we found that nurses who have higher levels of political skill, over the first 2 years of their career, they reported experiencing lower levels of mistreatment in the workplace, highlighting that political skill might be a protective factor against mistreatment experience for nurses. So this is one study we found in 2015. So mistreatment can be harmful in so many ways. I want to provide a few examples so that we understand why employers, supervisors, and employees should be paying more attention to mistreatment, so that efforts should be devoted to prevent mistreatment in the workplace. First, mistreatment experience can affect people's behaviors in the workplace. And research has shown constantly that people will have decreased job performance when they are victims of mistreatment, and they will engage in less helping behavior or citizenship behavior. So they're less likely to become a good citizen in the workplace when they are the victims of mistreatment. And they are more likely to engage in silence behaviors, meaning that they're gonna withhold their ideas. They're not gonna speak up if they have ideas to change the work environment. If they see something wrong, they're less likely to speak up because they're fearful of becoming the victim of mistreatment by speaking up. they're more likely to engage in withdrawal behaviors. So they are more likely to slacking or distance themselves from work. And a worker's creativity can be harmed when they are victims of mistreatment, such as bullying. When a person is persistently bullied by other people at work, it's hard for them to concentrate on creativity or concentrate on generating new ideas in the workplace. And also, as mentioned earlier, victims of mistreatment can also sometimes become the perpetrators as a way of retaliate their perpetrator, or as a way of displace their aggression. When a supervisor is, when my supervisor is abusive toward me developing strong negative emotions, trying to displace these emotions, I might not engage in retaliating behavior toward my supervisor. I might do it to my coworkers. So this kind of spiral between different mistreatment behaviors can happen in the workplace. And this is another reason that we want to prevent mistreatment, because it might lead to additional mistreatment behaviors in the workplace. Mistreatment experiences can also affect victims' health and well-being. It can affect workers' physical health. There has been research, including our research, showing that being victim of mistreatment can be linked to physical symptoms such as headaches, such as back pains through different mechanisms, of course. There's also research showing that mistreatment experience can be linked with more depression, more anxiety, more burnout, and also psychological stress. So overall, people's mental and psychological health and well-being can be also negatively affected by mistreatment experience. There's no doubt of that. And also people can develop negative attitudes toward job when they are victims of mistreatment, such as they're more likely to think about leaving their job, stronger term of intention, they're less satisfied with their job, they're less committed, they're less engaged. So people's attitudes at work can be affected, which might lead to turnover and less success in retaining high performers. And the people can develop all kinds of negative emotions, overall or discrete emotions, as victims of mistreatment. Mistreatment experiences, the impact might not stop in the workplace. It can also spill over to the non-work domains, such that it can trigger more work-to-family conflict of workers, and also can lead people to engage in some harmful behavior toward their family members. So there has been research showing that victims of mistreatment are more likely to engage in undermining behaviors toward their own family members as a way of displace their emotions. So being the victims of mistreatment does not stop in the workplace. And also, the experience of psychological distress as a victim of mistreatment can also cross over to people's partners. And there's research showing that when people develop psychological distress as a result of mistreatment experience, this distress can be contagious, and their partners can also report higher level distress due to this contagion. And some of the processes of why people experience decreased health, engage in certain behaviors, or engage in certain behavior in the workplace or outside work because of mistreatment. Some example processes might include emotional processes, similar as the perpetrator perspective. So when people become victims of mistreatment, they're more likely to experience decreased positive emotions. They're more likely to experience increased negative emotions overall, or they can experience some specific emotions. Similarly, they can experience anger, frustration, anxiety, but in addition, they might also experience fear because they are fearful of becoming victims of mistreatment again, especially for bullying when it's a persistent behavior experience. And also they might sometimes have feelings of self-blame. They might try to make sense of why was I the victim of mistreatment? And sometimes they might blame themselves for that. And this can lead to some harmful outcomes. There are some justice perceptions, of course. People perceive injustice when they are victims. their self-esteem will be affected, and this can lead to many negative outcomes. And people might ruminate when people think about their daily or experience in the workplace after work. They can still replay those experiences, which can have harmful behaviors. And people's emotional resources can be depleted in a way that they can experience emotional exhaustion, which can impair their health and well-being.
Albert, is it possible to wrap up? We have several questions that we need to get to.
Yes, I'm wrapping up in the two more slides. Yes. So I want to talk about, we learned to talk about the importance of preventing mistreatment, because it's harmful impact is prevalence. There are 3 levels of prevention that we can engage in. The first level is primary intervention prevention, which we can prevent the mistreatment, occurrence, or exposures, which can be achieved by providing trainings to workers, the importance of being civil or not engaging in mistreatment in the workplace, and also help building a positive climate, and also eliminate the stressors that it can trigger harmful behaviors. Secondary prevention will involve help people to better cope with that, so that people can be less affected. This can be done by by training leaders to be more supportive of their workers, and also providing more social support from co-workers, from organizations. And lastly, when the impact has already occurred, employers needs to be providing employee assistance program to better support or help their workers to deal with the impact. So, the next few slides are just expanding on the primary, secondary interventions. So be happy to talk more about that or later. So I think we can open up for the questions. I also want to just put up my emails here in case anybody has any questions.
Thanks so much, Albert. And we have only a few minutes to go. And I must note that there has been quite an active chat exchange among participants in this webinar. And I hope those of you who have been on the chat have enjoyed your exchange across everyone. But to look at the Q&A, one of the questions that came up several times is about the term microaggression. And how does that relate to mistreatment or any of the other definitions that you've given us?
That's a great question. I think microaggression has been last studied as a formal term in the scientific world, but we share a lot. It shares a lot of similarity with, I think, one thing, workplace incivility, because microaggression is different from, let's say, violence or overt aggression. That if a person is yelling at me, is cursing at me, I know it's aggression. That's examples of microaggression, and there are examples of incivility and ostracism that has been studied. So I have to say this again: we experience, or we have a little bit construct proliferation in the workplace, in the literature, that we study things differently, but they share a lot of similarities. So going that microaggression, the research on incivility, the research on perceived ostracism are closely tied to microaggression. So the findings that we have from those literature can be applied to understanding microaggression, such as the triggers, such as the impact, such as what can be done. For example, for incivility, there has been established intervention in the literature, in the research, showing that there is a specific intervention that can be used to create a civil environment to reduce the occurrence of incivility. I believe it can be applied to reducing microaggression from that perspective.
Do you have specific characteristics of the climate or culture that needs to be created in order to significantly decrease the incidence or prevalence of microaggressions, or in a broader sense, incivility, and various forms of mistreatment?
Yes. Two specific comments I want to emphasize. One is violence prevention climate, which concerns policy procedure and policies, practice, procedures, specifically preventing workplace aggression. But it's called a violence prevention climate. And also civility climate, which specifically talking about fostering a civil working environment. People are more respectful to each other. So this two specific climate has been shown to be linked with less experience of aggression and less experience of incivility. So I would say these two climate can be leveraged to build a safer and a civil environment.
Great. Of all those different forms of mistreatment, it's good to know that there are some protective factors out there. And unfortunately, we're at the close of our time here for the webinar. And I thank all of you who put questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, and also putting questions in the chat. I apologize for not being able to get to all of the questions, but this has been a very lively exchange of people about your topic, Dr. Zhou, and we really appreciate the time you've taken to inform us about an extremely important topic.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't get to talk more about the questions, but I did put my email in the chat in case anybody has any questions. I'll be happy to talk informally, like through Zoom, to anybody who wants to talk about workplace mistreatment.
That's very appreciated, and I'm sure the people who asked the questions in either the chat or the Q&A, that they can follow up with you and you will get back to them. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a good day.
Thank you so much.